Hi everybody, welcome back to Buy the Book. Today we're going to be doing the next review in the Adventures of Tintin series, Tintin in America, the book where things finally start getting good. Let's talk about it. So Tintin in America was serialised between the 3rd of September 1931 and the 20th of October 1932, and it was serialised once again in Le Petit Vingtième, which is the same paper that Hergé had been writing for in the previous books. And in this one, Hergé researched America a lot more meticulously, I feel, than he did with the other ones, because there's a lot of things that just feel a lot more accurate about the adventure, a lot more realistic, a lot more lifelike, just as they are obviously in America in real life at the time. For his depiction of Chicago and its gangsters, Hergé read the book by George Duhamel, which is known as Scenes from the Future Life. It's a 1930 book which, kind of gave a description about Chicago and its gangsters and the situation going on at the time around the 1929 Wall Street crash. And for the Native Americans who come into the story a little bit later on, he visited the Brussels Ethnographic Museum to research about the Blackfoot Indian tribes. And it's interesting because Hergé actually had quite a big interest in this tribe, so it's kind of interesting to see that in this story there's a bit more of kind of Hergé's own spin on things, his own interests that are put into the story. And it is to be noted at the time though is that because Hergé still didn't really have complete control over Tintin, he was still under kind of under the guise of his boss Norbert Wallis, who was a very Catholic Christian conservative, quite right wing as well at the time, which was a popular trend in Europe during the 1930s. He wanted the story to focus more on American capitalism and American conservatism, industrialization, mechanization, things like that. So, it's interesting to see that although Hergé did get a bit of the story I think he wanted to tell, the majority of the story was still kind of controlled by his boss, who was obviously the boss of Le Petit Vingtième. And it's interesting to see, really, and interesting to know about, again, to kind of look back at the window into America from the European perspective, in the sense that, Belgium's conservative view at the time was actually quite critical of the United States, although, of course, many Europeans did go over to the United States and kind of founded the country in many ways. They were quite critical of the capitalism, the consumerism, the mechanisation, and Norbert Wallis, again, Hergé's boss, he wanted to kind of depict this in kind of like in the similar sort of propaganda ways that the Congo was depicted, and also how the land of the Soviets was depicted as well. So there were various versions of the story that were released. The second one came in 1945 after the original 1931 to 1932 release. It had a few alterations of things. Some of the language towards like stereotyping the Native American stuff was toned down quite a lot. And there were also smaller alterations made a little bit later on in some reprints and things like that that came a bit later on. A few other interesting side notes before we get onto the story and talk about the review itself. Al Capone is featured in this story, and it's actually interesting because he's the only real life figure to be featured in an Adventures of Tintin series. There was not another one who was a real life figure who came into it later on in the series, so it was literally only Al Capone, the only real life figure to be featured in the Adventures of Tintin series. And another interesting side note is that it's quite possible that Rastapopoulos makes his first appearance in this story. For those of you, obviously, know the other stories, Rastapopoulos becomes the main villain, and he's like a reoccurring villain, major villain in the Adventures of Tintin series. And there's a scene right at the end of the story where there's a character in it who doesn't say anything, he's just in the background, but he looks strikingly similar to Rastapopoulos. So, yeah, just an interesting side note, really. Okay, with that being said and some of the background info down and out of the way, let's talk about the review itself, the good, the bad, and then give the final score at the end. Okay, so let's get on with the review. The first thing I do want to say, guys, is that I believe that Tintin in America is a massive improvement over the previous two adventures, which is something I'm really happy to say because I actually read this story and I thought, it's pretty good. It's not perfect, it's not necessarily my favourite story. There were certainly better ones that came later on, But in total, I do generally feel that this one is certainly better than Tintin the Congo and Tintin the Land of the Soviets. It just feels like the story itself was much. It kind of flowed a lot better. It was a lot more interesting. It was a lot more engaging. The racial stereotyping was massively reduced, and yeah, in general, it's a better story. That being said, though, let's get on and talk about the bad stuff first of all, or the stuff that could do with some improvement, could have done with some improvement, I should say, in retrospect. And then we'll get on to the good things, and then we'll give the final score. So, the first thing I want to highlight are the overuse of gags. This is something that kind of carries over from the other two stories. I do feel once again that there are a lot of gags thrown at the reader, and in some cases they're not always resolved so well. It's again kind of a clear symptom of the kind of 2 page at a time thing that Hergé used to do and how he used to write for Le Petit Vantem. In which, Tintin would be put in a situation, he'd then have maybe another page or two to try and get out of the situation, and sometimes, yeah, you can feel like, or it can feel like that they're quite rushed, that they're not really resolved particularly well. It's in many cases it feels like Tintin gets out of these situations not because of his own intelligence, but because of the bumbling mistakes of the criminals who have put him in the situation in the first place. So I think it would have been good, by this point to have seen Tintin kind of use his own intelligence in many cases to get out of these situations, rather than either just pure luck or the mistakes of the criminals who put him in these situations. There is also, again, a little bit of language stereotyping. There's a few incidents at the start of the story where I believe that they're meant to be Hispanic gangsters who are working for Al Capone, and one of them kind of like the way that they pronounce words in real life, who are kind of using a broken English. The way that they're kind of translated and written down into words is almost kind of stereotyping, really. Adding like the extra A or the extra O on the end of words and things like that, and it clearly not being correct, not meant to be correct English how they're actually speaking. I also felt, especially at the start of the story, the pacing was quite fast. It felt like literally, within the first page, the second page, Tintin is in and out of gags over and over again. He's getting bombarded with problems. And it just feels kind of like it kind of rushes into the story a bit too quick. And as I've said before in other ones, I understand that they want to sort of grab the reader's attention, and it was initially for kids. But, when it's kind of condensed together, when it's put in the albums as a story, it just feels like that there's a lot going on in such a short amount of time, rather than just, letting the story breathe, letting it kind of gradually mould into what it wants to become. But instead it just is like gag after gag. It's very, very fast paced. Although I did say at the beginning that the racism and the stereotyping and stuff like that is massively toned down, thankfully, in this one compared to the previous adventures, there is still a little bit that carries over, and I feel that there is some minor, you could argue minor racism towards the Native Americans, which I find in a way kind of bizarre, because ultimately Hergé was really interested in the Native Americans, and it was something, like I said, that he genuinely had passion about, and it was something that he really did a lot of research into. He went to visit the museum, the ethnographic museum in Brussels. So yeah, it kind of feels a bit strange that there would be that stereotyping going on, but there is a few examples that seem to kind of appear throughout a little bit. They are also in a way portrayed as a bit less intelligent than the Europeans, or the Europeans, I say the Americans, a little bit naive and sometimes even juvenile. When I want to get into a little bit later, when Bobby Smiles comes along, who's kind of one of the main villains in the story, they seem to almost follow his orders directly and just kind of instantly believe what he says, in getting their support to help him catch Tintin, and saying that Tintin's an evil person and things like that. So it just feels like they were really easily duped and easily convinced about things. There's a scene also a little bit later on in the story, well, kind of in the midsection of the story, where the natives get forced off their own land, and this comes after a gag that happens where there's some oil that's discovered, and Tintin effectively gets stuck underground at one point, and the tribes are trying to bury him and keep him underground to starve him out and leave him to dehydrate and die. And then just by chance under the ground there's oil, and then it's kind of like initially the gag's quite funny because literally as soon as the oil's discovered they sort of play into the whole like, oh, the American capitalist companies and things come in, they start offering Tintin all these contracts and for the discovery of the oil and things like that. And then as soon as they find out that the Native Americans are actually the ones who own the land, they basically forcibly remove them off land. They make a city there in its place. And although it is supposed to be kind of comedy, it does feel a little bit controversial and a little bit, I don't know, kind of a bit insensitive really, considering what happened to the Native Americans beforehand. And there are times, the final thing I do just want to say really, there are times where the book can still feel a bit like a propaganda piece. There is a fair bit of anti-Americanism that goes on as well, I feel, in this story, because like I said, Hergé's boss, and because he was quite into the Belgian conservative movement, he was in some ways you could say a real far-right propagandist. They were very critical at the time of American capitalism and the United States in general, and there are kind of occasions where it does feel a bit like it's almost a propaganda piece, that Americans are all like this, or they're all like this, and the natives are kind of like this. And it kind of in a way depicts the Americans in what I could probably describe as three main categories. You've effectively got the gangsters themselves, who are obviously the reoccurring villains throughout the story. You've got the cowboys, so the ones, the kind of, I guess, redneck cowboy hillbilly types who are kind of portrayed as being pretty bumbling and stupid and stuff like that throughout the story. Obviously the gangsters being real violent and ruthless, which, they were, so that's not necessarily a stereotype. And also as well, the kind of the other characters who are in the background all seem to be like these real, I guess you could say, like heavy capitalists. Like they all seem to be these real greedy, heavy industrialist sort of capitalist type of people. So yeah, they kind of pretty much all seem to fit into those stereotypes. And there's not really much leeway on other interesting American characters come into it. The cops seem to be strangely violent as well, which is something I noticed. They seem to have a knack for like hitting Tintin over the head whenever he sort of pipes up that he's in trouble or something like that, which I thought was quite odd and again a bit of a stereotype perhaps. But generally speaking, I think in terms of the previous books, like I said, there's not too much here that I think is like necessarily bad. But there are things throughout the story which, like I just highlighted now, that I think could have been improved. They could have been maybe toned down a little bit even more, and the pacing, like I said, was off and things like that. So, and it feels a bit like a propaganda piece at times. Okay, so with that being said, let's kind of get on to the good things now and talk about why I enjoy this story more than the previous two. So the first thing I want to say are that the drawings are a notable improvement compared to the previous stories. I feel that obviously with the research that Hergé did on America itself, the landscapes, the cityscapes, and how the country just looks in general, the costumes that people wear, the clothes and things like that, I feel that generally speaking it's really aided Hergé in his drawings, because this one certainly feels like it's been much better designed. The drawings are a lot more clearer and crisper. There's a lot more detail in the backgrounds, even compared to Tintin the Congo as well. And this one generally feels like it's America. It generally feels like it's in the place where it's supposed to be set. There's a lot of recognisable stuff that you could point to and say, yeah, that was America in the 1930s. So I certainly think from that perspective it's an improvement over the previous adventures. Tintin this one, which is really good, once again, he's likeable. Obviously Tintin the Congo, I found him really unlikable and pretty detestable at times, because he was effectively a big game hunter and also a little racist as well. But in this one he has a real active role. He's got a real purpose for being in America. He's there to clear up the criminals and get rid of the criminal gangs and things like that. And just in general, he's a lot more moral, he's a lot more smarter, much more intelligent than he's been before. And this one, in this case Tintin and Snowy as well, are both much more likeable characters. In terms of villains, Bobby Smiles I think is a real step up from previous villains as well. There are times where he genuinely feels like he's a threat. He keeps evading Tintin, he keeps getting away. And there's almost this kind of cat and mouse chase that goes on throughout the story, and it takes Tintin from Chicago itself all the way into the American outback or the American West. And I think it really utilises well that sort of that quest idea, the cat and mouse chasing, and it takes Tintin through various locations and various landscapes as well. So I think from that point of view, things were really better in terms of the villain. Al Capone, I wasn't necessarily impressed with so much. I think it would have been good if he had a bigger role in the story. He's only really featured in the very beginning of the story, and then we focus more on Bobby Smiles and his gang later on. But nevertheless, I think that, although Al Capone wasn't meant to be the main threat from beginning to end, the gangsters themselves throughout the story are a lot more threatening. They put Tintin in a lot more dangerous situations, and that aren't always so easily resolved. In some cases, anyway. I know I mentioned before about some gags that are a little bit kind of silly how they get resolved again, but yeah, they generally feel like more of a threat and just better written villains in general. There's a scene I want to highlight, which I think is one of the best in the series so far, which is the train chase scene. There's a part of the story where Bobby Smiles, who has evaded Tintin a few times already, or has tried to dispose of Tintin, they actually end up by chance spotting each other on trains, and then there's a big train chase scene that ensues. And I think, although it's quite chaotic, it's really, really well done. It's very funny. It's a lot of kind of gags, but they're all done in a funny kind of real engrossing sort of way. And I felt that this scene was a real good one and a real highlight of the series so far. That being said as well, getting onto the humour, I think in general the humour is a lot better in this story. It's not going for kind of so much with the racial stereotyping or making fun of like ethnic groups or at their belittlement or anything like that so much. It's done more in the sense of the characters themselves and kind of like the bumbling idiocracy of some of the gangsters and things like that. So in general, I think it's a lot funnier than the other stories, and some of the gags and things, they kind of work a lot better. I do feel as well that the characters themselves in the story, not just the gangsters, but also just in general the characters are a lot funnier and quirkier. They add a lot more to the story, and I think it's better when it's done this way, rather than them just being these stereotypes and used kind of as a mockery and things like that, and just kind of compared to Europeans as being much less. The characters, whether it's the Native Americans, whether it's the Americans themselves, they're just a lot funnier, quirkier. There's some more personalities that start to come out, and you may even argue in some cases there's some real early prototype versions of some later characters, like the drunken sheriff, who you could maybe argue is possibly an early precursor to Captain Haddock that came a bit later on. Or maybe the Thompson twins even, which might be more accurate. So, I think from that sense the characters work a lot better in this one. And then the last thing really just to say about the good stuff, I generally think that the part at the end where Snowy's kidnapped is quite an interesting part of the story, because there's almost like a lot of sub-stories that go on in this story overall. You've kind of got the part at the start, which is Tintin trying to deal with Al Capone and his mob. You then got the pursuit of Bobby Smiles, which takes him through the American West, and then he ends up coming back to Chicago. You've got the encounter with the Native Americans. And then later on, towards the end of the story, kind of into the third act, you've got the kidnap of Snowy as well. Which, again, I thought this was actually quite a good thing to do, because it really did raise the stakes for Tintin. It was the first time that he'd been properly separated for a long time from Snowy. And I think it really raised the stakes, and it kind of gave us more of an insight into who this criminal gang are, this big international organisation, and how the Chicago mob are kind of linked with the diamond smuggling and stuff that was going on in the Congo, which it kind of directly follows on from. So, there's a lot more positives about this story compared to the other ones. There's some interesting characters, some great scenes as well. Like I said, the train chase scene, which is chaotic but fun. The lynching scene that happens, I'm not sure. It seems a little bit excessively violent, maybe. But it does come off the back of the gangster pursuit and stuff. So I guess it still fits in quite well, and it kind of shows the kind of attitudes that people had in these small American towns at the times, without stereotyping them too much. Just in general, like I said about Tintin, he's he's a lot more of a moral character. He's much more righteous. He's obviously on the side of the good guys in this one. He's there to do good. He doesn't really do a whole lot of reporting. Again, I think in this story he's more of a kind of a bounty hunter in many cases, or a detective in himself. I didn't really see much reporting that he was actually doing. So I don't know what he's. Sometimes it's hard to tell what Tintin's role actually is and what his job actually is. But overall, a lot to take away from this one, and a lot that it has improved on from the previous adventures. Okay, guys, so let's get on to the final score. And I've been kind of considering this one a little bit, and I think the best I can give Tintin America is probably a 6 out of 10. I think that this story is certainly a step up from the previous two compared to Tintin the Congo and Tintin the Land of the Soviets. The story, the characters, the drawings, the humour, everything about it is certainly a step up. But there are still some things that I don't think were utilised as well. Al Capone being one of them. I think it would have been better to see him with a more active role in the story. I think there was still a little bit of stereotyping going on, and although it was nothing compared to the previous stories, it is still there and it is still present. It's something that thankfully later on continued to diminish. There are parts of the story that do seem to meander a little bit, and I feel that, initially with the gags and things, it does get off like really, really fast paced. It's like you're getting bombarded again with these gags, and they're not always resolved particularly well, which is kind of a recurring theme of the earlier stories. But yeah, overall, I'm a lot more positive about this story. I think it was certainly a step in the right direction. I think Hergé had a drastic turnaround from the previous stories. And I think it finally puts Tintin on the right course. It's the first story that I can officially say that I do enjoy. And I think it was a good story. The characters, as I said, were a lot more interesting. The villains, even the background characters, there were some interesting ones and some funny ones that were there. Some good stuff to take from Tintin America. Certainly not a perfect story. There were better ones that came later on. But overall, I think a 6 out of 10. It's a decent story, and it's one that I think a lot of people, generally speaking, enjoy this one. I think it's the first story that a lot of people kind of get behind and view as the first proper adventure in the Adventures of Tintin series. Interesting enough, just a last little side note, Tintin America was actually the first adaptation that was done in the cartoon series of the Adventures of Tintin, which was released back in the 90s. I can't remember the company that did it, but I think it was a Canadian company, and I guess you can sort of understand why, because of the Congo material and Land of the Soviets. But so from that sense, in many cases, it's almost considered like the first story in the Adventures, like the first proper story, by some degree. In terms of the TV series and stuff. But the first proper adventure, the first one that I felt was a good story, the first one that I felt was decent, and the first one that kind of got the series on the right course as well. So let me know, guys, what you think about the review and what you think about Tintin America. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you on the next review, which will be Cigars of the Pharaoh.